Hello, this is Dread, and in today's video topic, this is going to be the 0 to Hero build guide showcase for the Transplant Lich. The whole concept around this build is to just use Transplant and to hit as hard as possible. Really, that's all it is. Recently, they reworked Transplant to not have 9 explosions per cast, but instead they gave it a modifier like up to 200% more damage against cursed enemies, and I thought that might be enough to do damage with. Now, with these 0 to Hero series, I've been trying to play builds that haven't been played yet. So, and for Lich, that's a very hard thing to do, considering Lich is very cookie cutter as of the moment. Like, I've pretty much played every single Lich build that doesn't exist anywhere else. Like, pretty much we were running out of like ideas. So this time we were just playing Transplant. Now, should you play Transplant? I don't know. I enjoyed it, but it definitely isn't like the best build ever. There are better Lich builds, like Death Wave specifically is a better Lich build. There's the Infernal Shade Tech. There's a lot of other Lich builds as well, but Lich is just in that really weird spot where if I try to make a new Lich build, I would just not have a new Lich build because it would just be like the same exact old Lich build. So this is like the last one in the think tank for me, or at least for Lich anyways. So Transplant Lich. Now, if you haven't already, I would heavily suggest leaving a like on the video and subscribing to the channel, as that is the best way of currently supporting me, and it's the best way to show me that you want more videos like this on YouTube. Alright, started the character, we're naming it Period Blaster. Don't blame me, blame my Twitch chat, that's the name that they suggested me to take. Now, this was originally supposed to be a physical damage focused rip blood transplant kind of Lich build, but we realized due to efficiency's sake, it's better to run necrotic, as there's just a lot more necrotic scaling on the tree, and the flat on the tree is also necrotic, while also it just worked overall better. And eventually what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to get a Marinas with like some cast speed on it or something like that. I didn't actually end up with a Marinas this entire time, mainly because I wasn't trying to focus on it, but in theory a Marinas would be your best in slot weapon. So I'm trying a different approach to leveling this time around. The Wandering Spirit stuff is really strong no matter what you do for early on, and I wanted to try something different, so we decided to go with Rip Blood and specializing it first and going for the blood splatters. It was serviceable. Like, if, Wandering Spirits ever gets nerfed for the early game for some weird reason, Rip Blood would do just fine, but it's definitely not the best thing ever, and I would suggest just leveling with Wandering Spirits instead than what I'm doing here. Now, here's Respec's Orion down. Pretty quick, considering we have the flat damage from our Rip Blood stacking, and we have Wandering Spirits, which just does a lot of damage early on. Now, this is where I start to slightly regret running just Rip Blood. As you can see, the clear is not what I would call serviceable. It's okay early on, but it's not like anything to write home about. The damage is there for sure. Like, the damage scaling this entire run for the early game was pretty good. It's just not good enough for early on, because like it doesn't matter how much damage you do if you don't hit most of the screen, it's going to feel terrible anyways. I actually want to take this time to have a discussion about leveling in general. Since, we're just leveling another acolyte, might as well like shoot the breeze a little bit here since we have some time. So in my opinion, I really don't like the leveling meta for Last Epoch in general. Because of how easy it is to re-specialize your character, it makes it so that you're pretty much stupid if you want to like level a different way. Like, for instance, a lot of my audience, they really prefer to level as the build they want to play an endgame, and that usually does not end up being a good idea in 9 out of 10 cases. But I still subject myself to this kind of torture because, the audience wants it. Like, for instance, the Rip Blood stuff, I just decided to level as it because why not? It's not the best thing ever. It's not the quickest thing ever, but it gets the job done. And that's my problem, is if the respecs weren't as easy, then this wouldn't be a problem. It's kind of a weird catch-22. It's more of a psychological problem because, like, of course, I've done about 6 zero to hero runs at this point before this character, and I'm comparing this leveling to like Glacier Mage and like Puncture plus Umbral Blades, and anything feels terrible once you've actually leveled that way. So, we do actually have Transplant now, so we can actually, transplant around and do plenty of damage and, clear. But the idea early on is we're trying to get the Bone Curse node that eventually makes it so that whenever our Bone Curse times out, it will cast a Rip Blood on enemies. And the idea is with our Transplant and the Rip Bloods that we cast from our Transplant, we can get up to 4 hits to time out our Bone Curse to then cast a bunch of Rip Bloods. Now, what's really interesting though is this did not become relevant at all until like maybe 90% of the way through the character's journey, mainly because Transplant and Rip Blood were killing things too quickly in the end game. What would end up happening is we're trying to hit enemies 4 times to time out Bone Curse to cast even more Rip Bloods for better clear. But it turns out if you guys Bone Curse on something and then immediately kill it, like we did for 90% of the run, right? Turns out the thing dies and it doesn't cast the Rip Blood. So it actually kind of screwed us over in terms of clear slightly. Like, it turns out if you have too much damage, your clear can be bad if you're trying to use the Bone Curse tech, right? It's kind of weird because for the most of the run, my single target felt fine until the last like 10% of the run. And I think that's just most of these builds, how they're going to feel in general, I think, because I'm getting way too quick because of the new way that I've been pushing corruption quicker in the end game, where you do like the corruption leapfrogging and to like push your, bosses faster. What ends up happening is the boss fights end up being generically longer, which I'm annoyed by in general. And what do I mean by that? Well, this is an entirely self-made problem, because what ended up happening is now that I've done 6 of these now, and this is my 7th, I've gotten a few under my belt, I'm starting to quote unquote compete with myself. I'm trying to go faster and faster. And what ends up happening is the faster that you go, the less geared that you are in the end game. So for instance, to give you an idea later, if I'm not mistaken, I jump from, I think, 100 corruption to 250 in 2 boss fights. So I end up like tripling the amount of HP that enemies have while also not really tripling my gear at all. And that is because if you drop a lucky needle early on, you can make your life so much easier, like in general, to do your 10 out of 10 like grind. But the problem is what ends up happening is because of this, you're getting quicker. What'll happen is your gear isn't as good, so your Harbingers don't last that like they're way longer than they normally are. Like for instance, normally I would say like on an average run, I would say a Harbinger kill would take like 1:30 in most times of progression for the 10 out of 10. But for instance, on this character, it took about like 2 minutes, maybe 2.5 minutes to kill the Harbinger, mainly just because my gear just wasn't up to par. Also as well, I was dealing with some really weird problems in the late game, which we'll talk about later, but it has to do with like Reaper Form's interaction with the the second life mechanic, where like if you have Reaper Form and you get kicked out of it, you don't immediately die. There's some interesting tidbits that I've noticed about it. Now here's our heartened damage. It's definitely not the most heartened damage I've had, but I've also been insanely spoiled by playing Glacier Mage constantly over the past few days. So, yeah, I feel like as though I'm just like, I'm the problem here in terms of expectations. Now, we are getting Transplant to start actually hitting properly, like hitting for a decent amount, because you have the double explosion, you have the damage against cursed nodes. Like, there you go, you saw that. Like, Transplant's actually starting to hit pretty hard. And it's actually a theme that will continue on for most of this video, Transplant hitting pretty hard. It's not definitely a skill I would choose to race with, because The early game scaling is fine, but it's heavily reliant on access to cooldown recovery speed, which of course you don't have access to a cooldown pair of the cooldown boots, the Orbis boots. You don't have that plus cooldown on them, so you don't end up with enough cooldown to make it feel as good. Because even with like a large amount of cooldown now, I forgot that like they changed like transplant, all the traversal skills, they added extra flat cooldown, but then gave it a little bit of extra percentage cooldown on the tree. And what ends up happening because of this, trying to rely upon transplant to do all your damage isn't nearly as good as it used to be anymore, mainly due to the fact that, the cooldown's just so goddamn high. Even with like 100% cooldown, you end up at like a 3-second cooldown, and it didn't end up feeling that good in the end, only because of the cooldown. Like the damage was fine, I was hitting hard enough, but since you start out with such a high base of 5 seconds, it's not as good as I remember it being. Let's put it like that. I remember transplant hitting way harder before. Now here's our twins. Of course, divide and conquer is the way to go. If your build doesn't have that much sustain, it's way better to deal with one of them each at a time instead of trying to deal with both of them at once, because Xeric puts down a bunch of dot pools, which are very annoying to deal with. Even with the leech that you have as a lich this early on, just the amount of constant poison damage you're taking, and he also does decent physical melee damage as well. But as you can see, whenever we get to actually transplant, we do plenty of damage, but in comparison to the amount of boss ward bosses have, like, transplant doesn't seem like it's doing that much damage, and I think that's like part of my psyche telling me like, oh, you're not doing that much damage. I'm like, well, I did just like hit 50% of his like boss ward, or like I think like 3/4 of it, which is about half his quote unquote life. Like, I think the boss ward has done irreparable damage to my psyche in terms of how I view how much damage I'm dealing, because I've noticed I actually went back and looked at the strength stacking Beastmaster, and I realized I was doing plenty of damage for most of the playthrough. I just felt like I wasn't doing that much damage because not only was I progressing absurdly fast through the monolith without any gear, right? Which makes sense because I'm doing a, Harbinger run. I'm going to go as fast as possible just to get it done. Doesn't matter like how long the bosses take, right? But also as well, the boss word is starting to like hurt my psyche enough that like it's starting to hurt my confidence a lot, because I know, like, don't get me wrong, I'm not the smartest player of all time, but I've been playing Last Epoch for the past 4 years, so I would like to think that I have some kind of semblance of idea of like how much damage I'm doing here and there. And because of the boss word, it ends up kind of fucking with it a little bit, because you don't end up seeing the amount of real HP that they have until it's all up in front of you, which, is a little obnoxious. I did actually make a video about Boss Ward that, I posted yesterday, and the reception to that was interesting, to say the least. Not to interrupt our discussion, but Frostroot Warden down, thank you. Now here's my first Monolith of Fate. Yeah, I made a video talking about Boss Ward, and something I forgot to put in it that I regret a little bit is the concept behind like reward versus difficulty. So I don't like the boss ward system, or at least the philosophy behind it, mainly because as a gamer, as someone who plays video games, I usually like to go towards a challenge, and usually when you do that challenge, you feel like as though you did something. You have like a reward in your head, like some dopamine, because you did something that is like difficult, right? And when you start giving like kind of like quote unquote participation trophies, when you make it easier in general, what ends up happening, specifically in this state, where it's like, oh, well, it doesn't matter that you had a worse build. You still killed Alberath anyways, because every time you procced a boss ward thing shield, right? You just went and stood in a corner waiting for it to like decay, and then you went and did damage to him. So you end up needing only like a fifth of the damage as this build did, right? And it feels kind of cheesy in a way. Now, of course, that's not necessarily the best take ever, but I think a good example here is if you were to talk about like For instance, Activision here. So in Call of Duty, they have skill-based matchmaking, and they have been caught multiple times trying to manipulate the skill-based matchmaking in a way to make it so that if you suck at the game, they will put you in lobbies with like bot players and stuff like that to make sure that you're still playing the game. Because, you know, it doesn't matter that you suck at the game per se. They don't want you to grow or improve as a player. They just want you to keep playing the game. They don't want you to like, you know, improve. And that's like generally like how I feel about this situation. Like, for instance, when you make it the game too easy, then what'll end up happening is you end up with a bunch of people that want to have the thing be easy and to not learn and grow from it. Like, for instance, you know, if I were to die to a boss in Last Epoch right now, I would be like, I would go over my defenses, I would go over my damage, and I would see if there's any like things I can do to fix it, right? Like, for instance, later on in this run, I have a problem with being really squishy, so I fix it by improving my gear. But if you end up making everything easier, you never end up with these situations where the player character ends up doing something and being rewarded for it, right? Which is like my problem personally. Enough story time though. Here's our A-bomb. As you can see, when we actually get to hit enemies with the transplant, we do plenty of damage. It's just the problem is we don't have like that high of crit chance currently, but when we actually do get to hit them with the transplant, it's great. So it's kind of weird. I get used to this playstyle later, but there's kind of this negative mana thing going on that I need to maintain. And if I don't maintain it properly, I don't end up doing enough damage. And there's a lot of other problems with this build, which we'll get into. So if you don't know, there's a few nodes that allow you to do a lot of damage with transplant. I think at the end, I was hitting for 700k on the dummy with each transplant in the end, which sounds like a lot, but it actually doesn't end up being that much in theory because that's over 3 seconds, which I know kind of sounds reductive, but in this day and age where every single boss is like a bullet sponge and a half, you end up caring a lot more about DPS, not because like the bosses are hard or they require a skill check. They're just simply mind-numbing experiences because you end up just fighting them for so long that you just get bored, right? And you die because of your boredom. Now, there's a few ways of dealing more damage with transplant. There's the out of mana multiplier, so you can get 90% more damage when you're out of mana. This is very annoying to maintain, but it's definitely worth it as it doubles your damage. There's the 200% more damage against cursed enemies, which is your biggest multiplier. Then there's the 30% more detonating hit damage, and then there's the 30% more hit damage versus bleeding enemies. This combined leads to, of course, transplant hitting like a truck on top of course, all your other multipliers like reperform, your death seal and stuff like that. But the uptime of those 700k hits isn't very high. And that's because, you know, you have to line things up. You need to be negative mana. You need to have used Rip Blood a bunch in the past few seconds to get that juicy flat damage, right? You need to have your death seal up. You need to have your curse on the enemy. You need to be at negative mana, right? You need to aim it properly so both your detonations hit the enemy. You have to jump through a lot of hoops to do this much damage. And if you miss it, then guess what? You're waiting for 3 seconds. So I definitely feel as though transplant could afford to be buffed in a way to do more damage. But of course, this is just me with like my 10 out of 10 Harpy run. Like, it's very sketchy for me to ask for a buff on a skill like this, like transplant, which does so much damage, mainly just because, like, I'm sure with gear from Merchant's Guild and all the power creep and all that, you can make transplant hit like an absolute truck. There's like the unique pair of boots that like give you 40% more damage every 3 seconds, and you can transition into that setup. But like, you know, that's kind of a sketchy ground to talk about like buffs. Also, by the way, martyrdom, ha ha ha. So here's our third mono. As you can see, this is when we started transitioning into just necrotic hit damage. And like I said, it's because of marinas, but you know, we don't actually have access to marinas right now. So Fizz has better crit chance. You can cap your crit way quicker with Fizz, but with necrotic, you have much better damage scaling in the late game due to, of course, marinas on top of just necrotic percent damage being on the tree and stuff like that. So it really is just like, do you prefer blood or do you prefer toothpaste? Like, what do you want to choose? I like jam personally, but in this case, toothpaste seems to be the superior option. Uh, yeah, overall, the clear is pretty good, all things considered. The bone curse stuff is working pretty well. Pretty happy with it so far. Ah, yes, visiting our favorite penis farmer again. Here we go, Mr. Lagan. So, Lagan was actually really annoying for this character, mainly because since we're using our traversal skill as damage, what ends up happening is every single time I would want to, like, maybe dodge out of a schmack or like whatever else, I don't have my instant teleport. And that's a very big problem in general for a build like this because Lich is okay and tanky, but not when you're 20 levels under the zone with undercap res and his fizz attacks do absurd amounts of damage. So, better safe than sorry. It's better to just, dodge things. And I get kicked him out of Reaper form all the time now. It's crazy. Yeah, this is what I call like the Lich's conundrum. Uh, what ends up happening is because you have that extra life, you end up like being really tanky because of it, because you have, essentially double the amount of life. But what ends up happening is because you have that extra life, you end up playing more carelessly and recklessly, which ends up making like denying you all of the benefit of having that extra life. Like for instance, in theory, when you're doing a boss, if you lose your Lich form, it is better off to go and dodge the boss for a little bit and not hit him and do something else, especially with the boss ward system, right? You're incentivized to stay away from the boss when your Lich form is not up and not die. The problem is, that's fucking boring, man. Like, it's really boring. I hate that shit. I hate being a pansy. So it's just like, it's really boring to do that, but it is the proper thing to do, which is why I don't end up doing it because it's boring. Because I think that Lich letting you go balls to the wall for the most part ends up just being better thematically for me, anyways, being closer to death constantly, always being in the thick of it. Oh, God, please no. But, like, it's fun actually being in the face of things. That's actually another problem that this build ends up having is you end up being a pseudo melee build, which ends up becoming a huge detriment than an actual bonus most of the time. Now, here's our first 90 monolith. Another problem with liches in general is a lot of your tankiness comes from the fact that you scale armor based on your intelligence and on your HP. Death Seal gives you a lot of flat armor based on your HP, and of course you get a lot of flat armor from your Reaper form. And when you don't have those two up, you end up losing all of your armor scaling, and it makes you very, very strong when you're inside Lich form and Death Seal, but when you're out of those things, you end up being a squishy little bitch. Even if you have like 3.2k HP, it doesn't matter because you don't have all of the DR that other classes have. You don't have the aspect of the boar. You don't have like the less damage taken that all the other classes have, especially as a Lich, right? So you end up in this weird feast or famine kind of thing, and it ends up making Lich not feel good sometimes, even though it is one of the stronger classes currently. Now here's our shamans. Our shamans in Empowered actually ends up being absurdly difficult, mainly because Transplant doesn't hit all three of them if they walk around each other. And I accidentally had Chance to Fear on my character, which led them to constantly like walk away from each other, even though you're only supposed to fear things once. But here it ends up being pretty easy because we just have enough damage that we can delete them anyways. But later on, this becomes an issue. Now, of course, our favorite glue salesman here, Mr. Hirot, his fight isn't really difficult this early on. He doesn't do enough damage to care. But the problem is like, he just takes forever. Now, here's a quick DPS check just to show you like what we're capable of early on. Right now, I'm hitting for around 400k on the dummy most of the time with Transplant. But of course, later on, what'll end up happening is we'll get up to like 700k, which feels good for the most part. But like I said earlier, that is on a 3-second cooldown, so it's not actually that much DPS, all things considered. Now here's our first Harbinger. Us being a melee build is starting to actually be a pain in the ass. Turns out the Harbingers, at least the light ones, have a lot of anti-melee mechanics, and a lot of their damage is really absurd. Like, for instance, they constantly knock you out of Reaper form. That is probably one of the most annoying parts about this entire run, was just how many times I've been kicked out of Reaper form. I can't even count it on all 10 of my fingers. It's just really obnoxious. Quick side note, this is us joining COF real quick. Now here's our first empowered mono. But like I said earlier, getting knocked out of Reaper form makes this just so obnoxious in general, to the point where I would say, I can confidently say starting Lich is just uncomfortable. It's very strong. You do a lot of damage. It's just uncomfortable because having that constant threat of getting kicked out of Reaper form and then being a wet tissue in terms of your survivability, especially if you're trying to rush through like I am, where you're trying to get through things in a few hours, you end up, way squishier than the content in general. And this leads you to having to play very defensively, which isn't really what you're supposed to do as a Lich. You're supposed to be really aggressive, but because of how long boss fights last now, like for instance, if I die during a boss fight, that's another like 2 bosses I have to go through, right? Just to get it done. So you end up playing very defensively. And playing defensively just kind of sucks on your cycle start. You really don't want to play defensive. That's for like if you're trying to push like 1,000, 2,000 corruption. That is not what you want to be dealing with very early on. Like I said, I have plenty of damage. I have plenty of survivability, quote unquote, right? Like I'm doing fine in all of those merits, but I don't feel good, if that makes sense. Like I don't end up feeling good. Like here with the Harbinger of Chaos, as you can see in the background here, the Harbinger of Chaos really just fucks me up. Not physically, not on my character. Like my character's face tanking most of the stuff. I do get kicked out of Reaper form and all that, but with the waves and the constant damage I'm taking from them, and knowing that the Harbinger of Chaos does absurd amounts of damage at this point, stuff like that, it just hurts me mentally, if that makes sense. Like I'm not like dying to the fight. It's just more like it's just mentally taxing, because I know one lucky crit is enough to kick me out of Reaper form, and being out of Reaper form on a Reaper build just feels so bad because of, the binary nature. Like just there, like I don't know what I was supposed to do. Like I'll just take the damage. Sure, why not? It just feels really bad because there's this 1 millisecond where your death seal isn't up and your leech hasn't caught up to the max of your HP, which makes you significantly squishier in that moment than you would be when you have everything set up. But I don't know. Like I said, you end up just like performing way worse. Like right there, like that's enough to make me crap my pants and make me not want to play the game right there. Like getting hit like that makes me want to like put down the computer and like go and do something else. Like it's not fun. It's just obnoxious. Now, of course, again, to showcase how much HP Harbingers have, here's an Orbis. Oh, look, we just popped his first ward bubble. Look at that. Oh, look, we popped his second ward bubble while also deleting all of his boss ward. Oh, look, we're probably about to do it again here, aren't we? Oh yeah, look at that. Look at goodbye. As you can see, these fights are probably tuned a little too crazily. Now, here's our Harbinger of Treason. Like I said, the same tactic where you kill the worm on the right side, then you fight the Harbinger of Treason on the right side. Now, like I said, all of the mental damage has been done. I fear for my life constantly, even though like right there, I face tanked and leached back the void hit from him. And I've done the same thing for the fire stuff. I have 50% crit avoid, and they have a 5% chance to crit. That means that there is a chance that I get knocked out of Reaper form, and because there is a quote-unquote chance that I get kicked out of Reaper form, it's always in the back of my mind just eating away at me. Like there, like I could have been kicked out. Look, I almost got kicked out there. Just being on the edge of getting kicked out of Reaper form, I don't know, it's so weird. Like I would rather the character instantly die than get kicked out of Reaper form. It's such a weird kind of feeling. It feels like, I don't know, you know, like how you're in spelling bee and you fail a very obvious like answer, like for instance, like spell banana, and you accidentally put in an extra N and you fail the whole spelling bee because of that. That's how it feels to lose Reaper form, because it feels like it's pretty obvious that I shouldn't have lost Reaper form there, but I did. Like there, I lost Reaper form there, and it's just like, oh, okay, whatever, I guess. And it's not like as if I can play better. I have to be in melee range to kill the Harbinger, right? Because of transplant and shit like that. I don't know. Just the amount of mental damage that has been done because playing like a melee Reaper build is like enormous to me right now. Now, of course, this is our second Orbis. As you can see, it's also in a little bit of higher corruption. Now you can see again that I'm proving myself right, that, bosses have absurd amounts of HP, because this is an Orbis versus how long it took me to do that Harbinger. It's just crazy to see the difference between a shade of the same tier and a Harbinger of the same tier. I think it's like 5, 6, 7 times the amount of HP or something like that. Okay, here we go. So here's my shaman run. I'm not very proud of it, mainly just because it just felt wonky to me. There was a few reasons why. Like I stated earlier, the melee stuff sucks. Like, look at that one Harbinger sitting over there. I can't damage him right now, which is very frustrating because they're just standing there away from each other. And when you're not grouping them up, this fight goes from really easy to just cancer immediately, right? Killing them all at once is really good for the quality of life, mainly because of the fact that it just makes it feel so much better overall, because you don't end up dealing with the necrotic dot bullshit that they do at the end, right? Like for instance, the necrotic explosions that they do at the end when they die, like the martyrdom attacks, they do so much damage. And like I said, it only takes one crit to kick me out of Reaper form. I don't know how I can be at 2700 HP and feel this squishy at this point, but I think it's because of how much power creep the game has been like going through. Like for instance, if I was to play a mage, I'd have Flame Ward, I've had like DR, I'd have like Reactive Ward. If I was playing Primalist, I would have Aspect of the Boar, I would have like, the DR on it, I'd have more HP at this point. I'd have like all these different things. If I was playing Rogue, I just wouldn't get hit in the first place. But as a melee Lich form build, it just feels really awkward. Now, the Harbinger of Ash himself was just absurdly difficult for no reason. And that's because of that necrotic dot pool. What ends up happening is that necrotic explosion had the perfect amount of damage to kick me out of Reaper form every time, which means I can't just sit there and cast Rip Blood. Because the flaw with this build in general is I need to cast Rip Blood, I need to cast my Transplant, cast my Curse, keep my mana low, and all that. And it's not really worth the effort, I think. I finished this whole Zero to Hero run anyways because I enjoyed it, but I would definitely say that like this is definitely the worst Lich build I've played in a while in general. But yeah, we do end up taking down the Harbinger of Ash. It just takes forever because I don't actually get to DPS him. I spend half the time dodging attacks that will kick me out of Reaper form and make me a very sad panda. Now, speaking of annoyances, the Harbinger of War was really annoying, not because he's generally difficult, but because the other Harbingers have this problem too, where their random abilities, like they put random dot pools on the ground, they are indeed random. Like he can put it on top of himself, he can put it on top of you, he can spawn it on the other side of the arena, and that leads to the fight being like variably difficult. Like there, you put a bunch of dot pools near him, and that is so much more difficult as a melee build than if, he put them on the other side of the arena. Same, like, but if you're a range build, you got to completely ignore this fact, which leads me to believe, I think EHG, alongside every other ARPG gaming company ever to exist, hates melee. Like, if you actually enjoy melee in your game and you wanted to see it flourish, why is the boss putting like triple dots under their feet like that? Now, of course, this could be attributed to dot damage being absurdly strong right now for no reason, but I feel as though every single time I play an RPG, melee just seems to be punished. Just like it's not like a harder playstyle. Like, for instance, like, I don't feel like the build is worse than other builds. I just feel like I'm just generically being punished for wanting to be close to him, which is weird because, like, uh all it does is just make you not want to play a melee build. Like, right there, like, what am I supposed to do? Sit there and take the dot damage? It's such a binary problem because even if I was playing a good build at this point, I probably couldn't tank the dot pools. So it's either I sit on the dot pools and die, or I run away from the dot pools and not die. And binary things like that, where it's either you die or you don't die, never feels good. Like, for instance, I could see it if all 3 dot pools were on top of me and I died because of that. I could see that killing me, but only 1 dot pool needing to be under me while I'm fighting this guy to kill me, it's just obnoxious. Just obnoxious. That's the word of this entire run, I think. That's the word of the day, kiddos. Obnoxious. So here's some of our clear at 220 corruption. It's fine for the most part. This is like before I capped my crit. The moment I capped my crit and got to like 100% crit, right? My clear ended up feeling a lot better because, my transplants were hitting for enough and stuff like that. Also, as well as the monsters and stuff got more HP, the more effective the Bone Curse timeout ended up becoming. Like, for instance, at this point, the Bone Curse timeout actually worked, as you can see on enemies, right? As I hit them with the Bone Curse stuff, you actually see the Bone Curses going, like the Rip Bloods going off, right? And that's because we're actually, like, enemies are actually surviving our Rip Bloods and stuff like that, which is kind of entertaining. Kind of entertaining that things die less fast, but they end up dying faster because of the interactions, right? It's just kind of entertaining to see that. But yeah, this is our clear at 220 corruption currently. Now, our damage is starting to lack a little bit, and that's mainly because I decided to put all of my eggs into the chonk basket. I just got as much HP as humanly possible. And my reasoning for that is, if I am out of Reaper form and Death Seal, I do no damage. And if I'm not tanky enough to stay within Reaper form and Death Seal, as you can see, I just lost it there, it means that I do no damage. So if I'm a glass cannon build, right, I'll never have uptime on Reaper form and Death Seal, which in theory means if I try to focus on damage on my gear, I end up with less damage effectively because I'm not in Reaper form as often, which I think was my problem early on. I went for a more offensive setup and I wasn't thinking about defensive because most characters don't work like that. Most characters, you focus on offense first, then you focus on defense. But I guess this is like all weird shit, like whatever. Here's another quick mono as well. As you can see, our Rip Blood interaction with Bone Curse is finally working to supplement our clear, as trying to only clear with Transplant would be just insanity. As as that 3-second cooldown, you definitely do have to realize sometimes that some things aren't meant to be, and Transplant doing like clear and single target at the same time is probably impossible. So we introduced the Bone Curse timeout stuff technique, and you can actually see it in action, and you can see how many Bone Curses like Rip Bloods we actually get thanks to the necrotic Rip Blood, because you can see like the little AoEs and stuff like that. And that, like, it's so satisfying to watch all the little AoEs and stuff, in my opinion. Like, it feels great. Now, the problem is, as I always, like, it always ends up happening with this, is I'm like, hey, I can like finish this run very quickly if I rush my pants off, which leads to Dread not gearing anymore and not caring about gearing and just beelining towards bosses. I think that's generically my problem with this overall is with this kind of concept of doing the 10 out of 10 Harbinger runs is once I get to like the 5th or 6th Harbinger and I can kill them relatively quickly, I end up getting into this psyche of let's finish it now, let's finish it now, let's finish it now, mainly because I have content to make, I have work to do, and the faster I get these done, the more things I can do, right? And the more time I can spend with my wife. So turns out, as soon as like my build is quote unquote capable of killing all the rest of the Harbingers, I just go and do it. Even if it takes longer, like for instance, the boss fights will end up lasting way longer, but what ends up actually happening is it's way quicker to get this done because I'm not spending as long like trying to gear my character and stuff. So this is where the boss rush begins. Now here's our clear at 320 corruption. Turns out as long as you're like pushing really high in corruption, you end up getting to bosses way quicker than if you're at like 100 corruption. Who would have thought, right? And this kind of concept has led me to just constantly push as high as possible. Like for instance, I could probably do 400 corruption and get to bosses way faster and make the runs faster, but it would also be easier to just run my balls through the washing machine as well. So generally I found to as a balance, like 320 corruption is a good balance between the amount of stability I'm getting and the difficulty of the content for most of the quote unquote 0 to hero start builds. Because remember, I feel as though people forget this part. At this point, I'm not stopping to do prophecies like I should. I'm not stopping to farm gear. I'm not grabbing exalted echo nodes. I'm not killing the loot lizards on the side. I'm not doing any gearing whatsoever. I'm just doing the bare minimum required to get through the Harbingers, mainly because I just want to see how fast I can do it. Like, for instance, I think this character racked up like 14 hours of playtime, or it might be 13 hours. I'm getting faster and faster at the Harbinger runs, but I can definitely tell you as it gets faster and faster, the worst builds I end up playing, like for instance, not as meta builds, right? I'm just like trying to theory craft and stuff like that with this. What ends up happening is my time, my quality of time, right? The quality of fun that I have lowers a little bit, mainly because like you probably shouldn't be doing this. Like you probably shouldn't be rushing the 10 out of 10 Harbingers. It actually doesn't give you that much benefit to be finished with your Harbinger grind. Like it gives you extra gazes and stuff like that, but it doesn't give you access to extra gear in any meaningful way. All it does is it makes it easier to get to higher corruption, which already is pretty easy as it is. So actually getting to 10 out of 10 Harbingers isn't really that big of a deal. And the only reason I use it for the metric of this run is because like, what else am I going to use as a metric for the run, right? Like what else am I going to use? So the 10 out of 10 Harbinger thing is going to stay probably. Speaking of boss rushing, here's the Harbinger of Tyranny. As you can see, the randomness of the void dot pools he puts around himself is obnoxious when you're a melee build. Either it's like playing the lottery. Either he puts 3 of them on top of you and you instantly melt, or he puts them all across the arena and it doesn't affect you at all. Of course, you can always play a range build and skip all the bullshit. Now here's our 9 Harbinger. This one's more relatively easy than the others because the dot pool that he puts down doesn't do like the entirety of your health bar per second, and his attacks don't do as much damage. This is, I think, by far the second to last easiest Harbinger. I think the Reign of Dragons Harbinger is easier because the arena is better, but this one's definitely one of the easier Harbingers, which is why I leave him for last, as it's just convenient. Now, here's the last boss fight and the last Harbinger. So let's talk about the build while, of course, everything's happening. Let's talk about the recap. How was this build? I do not recommend it. Mainly because you're playing a melee Lich with no DR or anything like that. Lich's strong point are builds that can stay at range if they want to, like for instance, like the Infernal Shade Lich, or Lich builds that just do absurd amounts of damage because of mechanics, like Death Seal is a good option. But overall, I would rate my experience on my 10 out of 10 Harbinger rushing stuff very poorly, even in comparison to like Primalist, mainly because the mental fatigue that I get whenever I get kicked out of Reaper form is so high that it doesn't matter that this class does more damage. It doesn't matter that this class is effectively tankier than Primalist. It doesn't matter that, like, overall it's faster. The amount of mental fatigue I get every single time I get kicked out of Reaper form is so much that it just makes me not enjoy it. And turns out enjoyment of the video game is pretty high on the list of the needs that I have, especially considering I've done about 7 of these Harbinger runs so far. To give you an idea, I have killed 70 Harbingers, right? If I'm going to be killing this many Harbingers, I'm going to value my sanity over a little bit of extra DPS. And I think that the Lich stuff makes sense here. Now, of course, if I was playing a better Lich build, like the Infernal Shade build, I wouldn't have these problems, but I'm effectively playing a melee build in circa 2025 and last Epoch, where the devs hate melee a lot. So, yeah, that's why I wouldn't recommend this build. Here's the rest of the fight, by the way. I realized that it was going to take forever to do it because, the Reign of Dragons takes a very long time because he has an absurd amount of HP at this point. But here's the Harbinger of Destruction killed, and we're good to go at that point. I get kicked out of Reaper form one last time just to make sure that that mental pain is permanent. All right, here we are in game with the character. Let's go over detail, shall we? So for skills, the most important one is Transplant. Mainly what we're trying to do is we're trying to grab Curse Exile first, as it gives us a gigantic more damage multiplier. We also grab Rain of Blood, which literally doubles your damage, right? Because you get 2 detonations in total. Then we move over into Force Fruition for the more damage. You do need to make sure that you're out of mana, so make sure to spam Bone Curse to suck up your mana before a boss fight, and make sure you're constantly spamming it so that you can just hold the button down and it'll cast it when you have any amount of mana. Then you'll be out of mana for a few seconds, and then you can just get the more damage from this. Make sure to always be out of mana when you utilize Transplant on a single target. We also grab Dance of Blood. This actually makes her clear a lot better, as this, on top of the 2 detonations you get from Transplant, is enough to knock off Bone Curse on targets, which then triggers Crimson Enlightenment, which gives you a bunch of blood procs, which clears really well. That's why we're grabbing this. Then we grab 2 points into Flesh Marquee for the 40% more damage. Plus levels of Transplant would be insane on this character, like even +4, like 3 points here, 1 point here, eventually an extra point here from the Omnis or something like that. Plus levels would go very hard on Transplant currently, in the current state of it. Now, Rip Blood is our second most important skill here, mainly due to the access to Arcane Absorption. This gives us a lot of flat. It's for 6 seconds. We currently cast, I think it's like 3 Rip Bloods per second. So this is 18 times 8. This is like an extra 100 flat. To give you an idea, our wand only gives us 57 flat. So it almost like doubles our damage just by casting Rip Blood. Hence why this actually functions, because while we're waiting for our Transplant cooldown, we can cast Rip Blood and do damage that way and get a bunch of extra flat damage that way. Now, of course, we also grab Out of Mana, because the idea is actually we want to cast Rip Blood and consume our mana and get us close to 0, because then Bone Curse and bring us over the edge of negative mana always, right? So we're constantly sucking up our mana. Then we cast Bone Curse to make us out of mana. And since we have this node, we could have it kind of be binary, where if we have mana, we're sucking it up. And if we don't have mana, we can still use Rip Blood. Because the problem is, if you don't have this node, what'll happen is when you're out of mana, you can't cast Rip Blood. So it's just kind of a pain in the ass. But then if you try to make Rip Blood's mana con 0, what ends up happening is, of course, you have mana and you don't have a way of beating your general mana regen. So this node is very important. And of course, we grab the Blood Splatters, as this helps our clear immensely, as if we cast 10 Rip Bloods on a pack with our Crimson Enlightenment, that's 30 overlaps easily, which is great. And of course, area to make it even better. Now, for Bone Curse, Stereotypical Bone Curse setup with the Acute Affliction and Crimson Enlightenment, just like in our last Warlock setup. It's just mainly we're trying to abuse these two to proc it on a bunch of enemies and to cast a bunch of Rip Bloods. We also actually grab the Necrotic scaling because we are scaling Necrotic. Also as well, we get the Mark for Death so that we always get the more damage from Cursed Exile, because Bone Curse will actually fall off on the enemy, mainly because it will actually fall off, so you can't rely upon Bone Curse on being your quote-unquote curse on the enemy. So make sure you keep that in mind. We also grab Ruptured Corpse for enemies that actually survive that die instantly. We still get a decent amount of clear out of this instead of us like killing like spiders instantly and not getting any extra clear out of it. It also adds a mana cost. This also adds a mana cost. So we end up with a 22 mana cost Bone Curse, which I found to be the sweet spot of not too much mana cost, so we can spam it while clearing and not run out of mana, but we can also spam it on single target and to run out of mana. This is like the perfect buttery zone for it. Stereotypical Reaper form setup, nothing too crazy. Main thing, armor point per intelligence, less drain. We actually grab the crit chance and the damage here. Also as well, the attack and cast speed. Good. That's pretty much it. We do also grab Haunting to get the Mark for Death chance, because this Mark for Death, for some reason, has an 8-second cooldown currently, an 8-second duration, which is much better than the Mark for Death from Bone Curse. So having a 5% chance to do that, when considering how many times we hit, and makes it feel much better on single target. Then for Death Seal here, mainly, we're of course grabbing the stereotypical setup where we grab Deadlock to put us at 33%. Then we also grab all of the Death Wave stuff. It reduces Death Wave damage, but it makes it hit more often. The main reason we do this is it gives us a lot of extra damage on single target, helps us keep up on our armor shred stacks for our Transplant, and it also procs our Crimson Enlightenment on our Bone Curse much easier. So we Transplant into a pack, even if like we just end up with enough hits to constantly proc Acute Affliction to clear effectively. And of course we get the duration, then we get the area eventually for a Wave of Death. And that's pretty much it for Death Seal. That's pretty much it for the skills. Let's talk about the passives. So here we're just grabbing the armor, grabbing the intelligence and the necrotic resistance. Remember, intelligence is good with this setup because it gives us 4 flat armor per point. So we get like 32 flat armor here. Then we also get like 160 armor here. Armor scaling is really strong on Lich, so you want to lean into that as much as possible. Some vitality, whatever. Warlock here, mainly just a little bit of bleed chance here, mainly to proc our Flesh Marquee. We don't need too much bleed chance, just like 2 points here, a bunch of HP, because you need as much HP as possible when you're playing a Lich, because HP scales your armor, and you just need HP in general as a Lich, so you just want to grab as much as possible. Speaking of that, even more HP and armor here, perfect Harrowing Armor. I would suggest grabbing all these first, mainly because like just having more HP in general is better early on. And of course as well, more HP, more damage here, more intelligence, which is damage and of course armor, survivability. Necrotic Pen, very good. Eventually would be 10 out of 10 necrotic energy. We're grabbing the 100% crit chance here in the cast speed, the crit multi, the cast speed, and the leech, and also leech as well. All that combined is just Lich. It's very simple, as Lich is just a very simple class in general because it was made like 4 years ago. Now for our gearing, no mandatory uniques, although a what is it called? What is the wand called? But the Marina's Lost Soul, right? The Marinera's Lost Soul. You want that, but with cast speed. Pretty much, you just want this, but as a Marinera. Because the idea is you want to cast for your Rip Blood, but you also want a Marinera, as it just gives you a bunch of % damage, and of course, the crit chance is pretty good. I am running a Phantom Grip because I got really lucky on it because I got int and HP on it. The idea is it gives you a bunch of extra base crit. We are actually capped on crit when we're in Reaper form, and this helps a lot because it means we don't dud with our Transplant, which can happen when you have less crit. So 1 Phantom Grip is advisable, so use your Runes of Ascendance on rings probably. Now, for gearing overall, here we have some crit chance, HP. Remember, Lich can handle your damage. When you are a Lich, your priority is to keep up your Reaper form. Reaper form is absurdly important for this setup. So you want to make sure you get chunk first, damage later, okay? Like I said, HP, terrible amneal otherwise, but has a lot of HP, right? Same thing here. This chest, I got really lucky with the tier 3 seal. A lot of armor, a lot of HP, a little bit of damage, mainly just survivability, right? Here, we actually got a lot of damage from this crystal skull. I got really lucky with it, with the spell crit, the crit multi, and the base 6%. Cool. This ring here, I went for strength. The reason why strength is so important is because since we're scaling armor so hard, even this 13 strength here ends up being like about like 50, I don't know. Yeah, it's like 52% increased armor, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when all of your defenses is armor, it actually ends up being a lot. Then belt here, cooldown recovery speed, HP. Then gloves here, shred. You actually want this to be on the amulet, not on the gloves. But then HP, cast speed, intelligence, better gloves probably. I actually made a mistake with this character. I didn't cap my endurance the whole time, and you're pretty much at your endurance the entire time you're playing this character. So make sure to do that. Don't be like me. Actually cap your endurance. Here, movement speed. It should have intelligence there, HP, and cooldown recovery speed. Good. Eventually, you can go for the cooldown recovery speed boots from Orbis and get cooldown recovery speed on them, but that's like really high investment shit. Or you can go for the boots from the arena where you give 40% more damage for your next movement skill or whatever. That works as well. Then relic here, HP, a little bit of damage. Mainly HP, that's all you care about. And idols, damage, HP. It's because Reperform and Death Seal give you all your damage, so you want to maintain these, but to maintain them, you need to be tanky, which is what my focus was on this character, was to be as tanky as possible. Now, that's pretty much it for the character. That's pretty much it for me. Well, that being said, this has been Dread. I'll have to go do something else. Bye.